All right, we're going to start. This is the recap podcast for CFFB auction that we just concluded. Well, it's not officially over. It kind of runs through the summer, but the main activity is all kind of ceased at this point. There's people have spent the dollars they're going to spend, and we should spend some time kind of revisiting how everything worked out for everyone. I am the commissioner. I'm Brian. I am the Wisconsin Badgers. I'm joined right now by Andy, who is of Illinois, and then
Howdy. Good to be here.
also at the moment we're being joined by Joey, who is of UConn, Mr. Husky. Is that it? Is that the title? The title that you won, Joey? Is it Mr. Husky or Mr. UConn?
It was Mr. Yukon, but I didn't win it. I was honorable mention. Thanks though.
What? In our eyes, you're Mr. UConn. So like we talked about, we are going to kind of we just had 2 weeks of auctioning. Just kind of recap everything that happened, highlight some interesting stories, teams, notice some general trends on how things acted, because this will play out again next year, and it's always kind of cool to see things either repeat or what's different of this year that we haven't seen before. So we're gonna kind of highlight that. I know I asked at this week to the group if there's teams that we wanted to highlight or people that wanted to have their team reviewed and things like that. Given the overwhelming response, we'll try to stick to general conference groups, and we'll try to highlight certain teams or actions in an auction that were noteworthy. Because if we spent all the time highlighting and reviewing everyone, we'll be here all day. It'll be longer than when Lou just talks about his team. So, with that said, I guess let's start with the two defining periods of this of our auction period. One is the upperclassmen transfer portion, and then we always have a rookie centric portion of our auction. It all kind of blends together. There's no firm breaking point. Let's start with the upperclassmen part first. We'll kind of breeze through that because I think most people care about the rookies. But the big thing to note this year, and I think everyone can probably, you two both probably would recommend, there was a lot of upperclassmen transfers this year, far more than previous seasons. I think people are starting to catch on to the trend a little bit more. Some teams are really starting to understand when they need to fold it and get rid of their assets and sell them for something. And no better conference this year emulated that fact than the ACC. The ACC, I forget how many guys you kind of had noteworthy in terms of auctions, Joey, but you guys had a lot comparatively to everyone else.
Yeah, I mean every star player you could think of pretty much hit the board there. People were really resetting their teams.
So we had 26 total transfers go in ACC with names ranging from like Bijan Robinson was the most notable name and went for the most dollars in ACC at 100, and but it ranged from Bijan all the way down to Trevor Lawrence, two Devonta Smith copies, Jonathan Taylor, Jalen Waddle, Kyron Williams. There was a bunch of running backs, a couple wide receivers, two noteworthy quarterbacks that got transferred. So I think it was bananas. There was a ton of spending. I think in total, you guys spent $652 on transfers this year. That's pretty sizable when your original budget is only 3,000, so that's almost a fifth of the entire starting budget getting spent on upperclassmen. And so that meant a total of like $330 came back into the auction to select teams predominantly, as you guys can see on the module that I posted. Virginia Tech, Pitt, Louisville, and Virginia were the predominant like top four teams to get players back with Louisville, Pitt, and Virginia Tech all having 5 or more transfers in that portal. So Louisville, Pitt, and Virginia Tech were all hitting the reset button pretty hard. I think Florida's 2 were somewhat from a position of strength. So they were the ones that transferred Trevor Lawrence, and I think they had someone else that was not nearly as noteworthy. Oh, Elijah Mitchell. So that one wasn't there, but Trevor Lawrence was the big one from them. And then Joey, you transferred Devonta Smith. I don't know if you want to kind of brief maybe what your thought process is on that piece, especially knowing how many players were in the pool at that time.
Yeah. If it can help everybody out. So Devonta had already been dropped by another team, and I was deciding whether or not I wanted to do a second drop. And I was nervous because the wide receiver class is deep, and there's already a Devonta out there. So I was worried, well, I need to get this Devonta out there right away, because by the time the second Devonta comes out, maybe people are done with spending their money. I was wrong about that. Devonta ended up going for the second copy, ended up going for more. I just, at the time when I had dropped him, it was the day before the deadline, and there hadn't been that many drops yet. And then all of a sudden, at the end of the day, Pitt had dropped a bunch of people, and it was like the landscape kind of changed. So I thought I waited long enough to figure out whether or not I could kind of maximize my dollar on Devonta. But the ACC was wild, and I think no matter planning for anything in this conference may seem like a bad idea, and just kind of have to look at your team and decide whether or not you need a guy or not. He was the only upperclassman I really had, so I just I punted.
Yeah. I don't think it was a bad idea. I think you made the dollars that you were going to expect from a player like that. I think it was just like 2 under what you would project for a senior year wide receiver at his like ADP price point kind of spending. And the other copy went for just like $5 more. So it wasn't like you lost a ton of value. The teams that spent the money in ACC comparatively were also really consolidated. So we saw, like we noted, there was a few teams that really purged their rosters, and there was a very few teams that were the big buyers. That was North Carolina, who I can't remember exactly how much they spent, but they spent like a ton of money.
I think they had like $6 left by the time
Yeah, so they spent.
the freshman
Let me
started.
see how much did they start with. They started with $224, so they spent over $200 on upperclassmen, and they got quite a haul. Brees, Tua, they needed a quarterback absolutely, so they got that this year with a 1-year rental of Tua. Got Jonathan Taylor, got that second copy of Devonta as their primary haul, and then I think that was really it. The other big ones that spent was Wake Forest, spent a lot of money. I think did pretty well with kind of consolidating it to just some wide receivers, and then they purchased Trevor Lawrence, which was, I think, if I were to guess, wasn't one of the buyers for a QB that I was expecting. I was expecting North Carolina State and North Carolina to be the ones kind of hedging for a QB mostly. So Wake Forest entering the fray really kind of mucked up that QB market for upperclassmen, I think specifically for NC State more than anyone. And then Clemson was another one. They spent the most on one single player with picking up that Bijan Robinson copy that went for $100. So the ACC is kind of spread out into 3 big camps of kind of teams. There's the obvious contenders, which were the ones I think were pretty much spending quite a bit on upperclassmen this year. Then there's the teams that are kind of in this middle stage where they are coming off an immediate rebuild, like Miami, or teams that kind of are in a soft frame of mind where they are building on top of themselves, kind of like Joey's team is kind of that middling group. And then there's clear rebuilders, the Virginia Techs, the Pitts, Louisville, that are all like starting from scratch, and they're trying to just rake in as much money as possible. So there's 3 big camps that came out of the ACC, and their upperclassmen auction was notably different than most, just because of the volume of players. Converse, opposite of them was really our conference, Andy. The Big Ten did not have that many prized players available. Most of them came from one team, and that was Michigan State. Michigan State was kind of in this rut where they had a bunch of seniors or juniors, and they didn't really have much else on the team to make something to build upon in the next year or two that they could be back in contention. So they threw their remaining assets into the pool, and really the activity was me, you, and Navy were the primary spenders on upperclassmen, and I was the one that walked away with the three notable prizes this year of Devonta Smith, Breece Hall, and Najee Harris. I don't know if you have any takeaways from the upperclassmen. I definitely have some thoughts on just how our conference tends to operate in the space.
Yeah, I've got, I guess, a general view first. As you mentioned with the ACC, teams dividing themselves into three different camps, kind of that immediate contender, the hard reset, and then I think you used the word middling, but I would say more of just in the process of rebuilding is probably a more fair way to phrase that. But yeah, in the ACC, we saw the contrast to the Big Ten with ACC having a lot more options out there for transfers, so there were more teams that were able to get slices of that pie. In the Big Ten, as you mentioned, you kind of took the big prizes home and, took yourself out of the rookie auction as a result. And yeah, Penn State and I think it was Penn State you said, that we're bidding on things. We ended up giving up because I think we're both big value hounds. So once the numbers went higher than we were comfortable with, we kind of backed off. But, in retrospect, maybe that was not great assessment on our part. I don't know. We can get into that when we talk rookies as well. But yeah, the scarcity made a big difference since it became the Wisconsin show as far as the upperclassmen were concerned. Yeah, so we necessarily had to pivot to looking at the rookies then.
I think I talked to both you and Navy, who is the other big spender, because Navy and I were fighting for Devonta and Breece quite a bit, and then after I had secured those two, I came back at Najee because I was like, from my perspective, I think I told you this, I was like, I spent all this money, I might as well just go in instead of trying to like cultivate something that is super balanced from a rookie perspective. I think I just might as well just grab that asset, and I think you just like, well, the value is really not much there anymore for Najee, and you just kind of bowed out and said, I'll just pivot for that. And I think Navy was the same way. He was saying, I was on the fence in the Devonta price. I'm kind of glad you spent the money, but I'm also kind of upset because you're getting these high-valued, highly productive players, and he just was more wanting to make sure I didn't spend, and wanted to make sure I spent enough. If anyone was going to walk away with these players, that they had enough being spent on them, and Jeff justifiably spent enough. Otherwise, we really didn't have much. We had a bunch of like flyer bids, Cedric Tillman, Hassan Haskins, John Mechie, which was one that you put out there. People that were just kind of cutting bait on a few players, and some of the rebuilding teams were taking flyers on them. That was really the activity for the Big Ten. Big 12 was a little bit different. Kansas kind of threw everything into the pot. They were kind of on the last year of potentially contending. They had gone 2 years of making the playoffs, winning the Big 12, and this year I think they were like, I lost a few pieces. They lost Jonathan Taylor. They lost Justin Jefferson. And so I think they were looking at kind of what they were having left and just thought maybe I'll get a year early on the rebuild, and threw a bunch of pieces out there. Most notably, threw out Jahmyr Gibbs, which was an asset that had 3 years left, really productive a year last year, and threw it out there. And the two that, the team that kind of came calling was Marshall. I don't remember who was bidding all this high on Marshall to compete for that piece with Jahmyr Gibbs, but walked away with $100 or $123 he went for. Was the most expensive upperclassman that came out of this period. And then a few other pieces that came out of Kent State. Kent State Taylor's team kind of threw two big high-value pieces out because they need some more dollars to help. So not as many pieces. They had some more notable ones. They were kind of in the middle. The same with like Pac-12, really didn't have too many pieces out there. They had a Brees Hall, Drake London, Travis Etienne, but they had about 4 or 5 pieces. Jerome Ford was obviously one that kind of got thrown out there, and they were kind of scooped up for something that's generally a little nominal. But I think that was kind of an underrated play by Washington because Nick Chubb might not be healthy, and so to get a guy like that potentially just for around $10 was kind of cool, I think, for them. But the big thing out of the Pac-12 was the Arizona State kind of folding. Arizona was also folding and starting to rebuild, and same with Utah. So they didn't nearly have as much activity. Some of these prices were a little more depressed than some of the other conferences, even with the scarcity piece. But yeah, they didn't really have too much. The SEC was the other conference that had quite a bit of activity. They had a feverish battle for 1 year of Tua Tagovailoa between Kentucky and Arkansas. There was this frantic bidding. Tua was the only upperclassman QB that went out in transfers, and it showed with the price of $81, which was the highest QB that went. And he was only 1 year, and though a lot of projections for 1 year QBs was like more around $20, $30 for most seniors, and this one went for $81. So really a scarcity play where some really QB needy teams came out there and they had to spend on one asset. And so the other assets were kind of pretty close. Rashad White and Jonathan Taylor all went for seemingly the same amount. I'm a little surprised someone spent so much money on Kyle Pitts. I'm not a Kyle Pitts guy. I'm also definitely not a tight end guy. So to spend $20 on a 1 year of Kyle Pitts, there must be a believer out there somewhere, but it ain't me. And then the biggest asset that was being sold was the Jamar Chase from Missouri, who just needs more assets around his young QBs that he has on his team. So yeah, Joey, I don't know if you have any comments on your old team transferring Devonta and Kenneth Walker. Weird kind of pivot, if you ask me. Sometimes.
Yeah, I'm not. He needed running backs, and so to get rid of Kenneth Walker was a questionable move. But the Devonta, I think, made a lot of sense. I had grabbed a ton of wide receivers the year prior, a lot of which hit, and so he was in a position. He also had the rebate on Marvin Harrison, so I get that. I get that part, but the Kenneth Walker one really didn't, especially with the added RB position. I didn't really understand that.
I don't know if it was because he was trying to get more money, because I think you had Will Levis on your team. I think he was looking for a better QB too. So maybe some of that was to sponge up some more money to.
Oh, he had no QBs. He
Oh,
had Mac Jones and some scraps. Yeah, and that Will Levis would have been a huge upgrade for him. He's got nothing. I kind of left him bare bones at the quarterback position.
yeah. The other interesting play that I think is maybe a little noteworthy. It's not like this sizable play by any means, but it was an interesting wrinkle I was kind of coming to mind. So you mentioned Mac Jones. These backup QBs that exist that are upperclassmen, the Zach Wilsons, the Mac Jones, Davis Mills, like I feel like those could be kind of sneaky transfer plays just to recoup maybe $1 or $2. Nothing sizable, but I felt that was an interesting meta that kind of came out of this year, kind of realizing like, oh, I could easily throw an upperclassman, upperclass QB that's got an easy handcuff in the league, nominate him for $0 during the upperclassman auction, and someone who has that primary QB piece should come and pay. And so maybe I can get $1 or $2 to add to my group. It's not this sizable thing, but we did see some of those actions like Missouri dump Zach Wilson. I didn't see any Mac Jones get dropped. I say that, and then there was one down here for $0. But I think you did that, Joey, too. In ACC, you had dumped Zach Wilson, and NC State came calling for like $1.
Yeah, I got $1 for him, which I mean, in hindsight, I guess I don't know. I'll take the dollar, I guess, but I ended up not spending a dollar at the end of the auction, so I guess I would have rather have had Zach Wilson.
Okay.
I personally hate the transfer market, the whole idea of it, because I can't get it right. But I know it's good for the league, but I just personally am not a fan.
Anti-transfer. Quite a take. And then lastly was Minor. Minor definitely had some good activity. It's a few teams folding. New Mexico, UNLV, Wyoming, and Ohio were all kind of throwing their assets to the wind. Some notable teams that spent a lot was Kent State, Ball State, and Utah State, all spending a good amount of money, $90 some odd dollars for some assets, but and also not a lot of seniors were given up. They had Kyle Pitts and Jonathan Taylor that were sold. One team I do want to highlight, didn't plan on highlighting them, but I feel like it was very odd bidding in the minor, was Western Michigan spending something like $61 on Kyle Pitts and Trey McBride. To me, those were the two dollar amounts that were being spent on upperclassmen that I couldn't wrap my head around as a piece, especially given the team that's there, spending $60 on two tight ends.
Maybe he's a big fan of Jumbo Set.
Could be, but I just don't know where the value is in, especially 1 year of Kyle Pitts at $30, and then Trey McBride had a good year last year, but I don't know how much the effectiveness of repeating is for that. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on how this kind of carries into next year, the transfers, if this becomes more of a trend where more assets are kind of populating, or if this was a 1 year, given who those teams were that were giving up these running backs and quarterbacks, or if we're starting to kind of settle into a little cyclical action where people kind of really sell things at a better point in time instead of holding on to an asset until the bitter end.
I kind of suspect this will be a macro trend going forward. This is year 4 of this league, if I'm not mistaken. So I think we're finally hitting the point where the teams have like any dynasty league. I know this is not the same as a regular dynasty league, but in any sense that might even accelerate the process where once you hit year 4, that seems to be the sweet spot where teams separate themselves into contenders, rebuilders, and somewhere in the middle. Although in this format, it's a lot easier to build something from being in the middle. Typical dynasty, when you're in the middle, that's the dead zone. But I do think this will probably maintain this trend going forward. I do think that teams will identify when they have nothing to help themselves compete, and will just hit the hard reset button. I think especially the more we get used to this format, the more we play this league. I know we did expand the playoffs to 16 teams this year, but when it was 8 and you're playing in a 100-team league, it's hard to win this thing, right? So if you're not coming in with a pretty strong roster, or at least some interesting upside, it's not a bad idea to just hit the hard reset button, even if you are somewhere in that middle. It's certainly a play that you can use. That's not, it's legitimate strategy, right? It's not why did you do that? So I do think that as these teams continue to become powerful units versus these teams with nothing on them anymore, this trend will probably continue year after year.
I agree. I think generally this is likely more of an act of self-preservation than anything. This is the best interest for your team to do some of these things when it makes sense to. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to do this, but I kind of rationalized this with Joey. He was asking kind of on the fence about Devonta Smith and cutting him, and I was trying to rationalize it with the logic of do you think, one, he's going to add enough value that it makes your season even more worthwhile being on your team, or is the player rewards he could potentially win you more than what you think the return is. And I think what it was it kind of broke even at that point, if I remember. How much was your Devonta? You got $13. So like for him to get $13 for Joey this year, he'd have to like win the Heisman, not win the Heisman. He'd have to win like first team conference and get a first round like draft pick piece to be supplemented when he leaves the door to get just $10, and then he'd have to like help you win 3 games, which is very plausible, but I feel like the margin for error for those things seems so great where he could just get $13 now to help build his team in the immediate. So that's the way I kind of rationalize it with a lot of these pieces. If they can help you win, that's great. If they don't, then it's really not worth like holding on to them. It's probably better to sell them. And it kind of the other added piece is it pushes the buyers. At least I would view it this way. It pushes the buyers to spend money. So the Clemsons, the North Carolinas, the Wake Forest, even myself, we all had to put money in that we don't get to use as competition for rookies for helping, like the pool out, or we're not competitions for the Caleb Williams and like those assets for it. And you can kind of bleed us out of that money to be able to use to get your guys. So I think it kind of like takes a little money out of the entire pot when people put these guys up to help the teams that need it to get those rookies in to kind of restart their team's rebuilding process is the way I really view it and the value. So I think that will continue. I think people will get more familiar with it and know when to like cut bait. The challenge will always be when new people come in, can they identify those weaknesses? Can they identify the value of that? That'll always be a big question mark. I was really surprised because Pitt was an entirely new coach with like maybe hours or days to figure out if they wanted to do what, and they decided to cut their entire team, and I think it proved to be beneficial for them. So that's upperclassmen. I think it was really active, a lot of fun to watch, and even participate in, but I think it'll be more robust in the future. So moving into kind of what everyone cares about more, though, is the rookie auction pieces. And rookies this year, I think we saw a lot of different tactics being done. I saw a lot of really noteworthy, like, what the fuck is going on? The best thing about the rookie auction this year is we did not have anyone go missing. We had some people that were hard to get a hold of, but everyone paid attention. I didn't have to replace anyone mid-auction, and I think that was a really big positive out of this year, out of any other year that we've done this. So everyone paid attention. It took a little bit harder to get hold of people like Tennessee or UCLA, and like I said, we proactively replaced Pitt before the auction, but everyone showed up and bid at some point in the auction, so that was great to see. I'm going to pass it to you guys. Did you have any general thoughts or feelings on just how the overall auction went, either within your conference or as an entirety? Was there something noteworthy that you thought is worth kind of bringing up here at the start? Otherwise, kind of do something similar, diving into each conference.
Yeah, I can save the Big Ten specifics for when we get into Big Ten, but I did think that one note on as we talked about with the transfer market being more robust than in past years, I do think that kind of skewed how the money was in the rookie portion. Because as you said, it kind of took money out of the hands of some people, but it also created new dollars in the hands of others. So I think as a general rule, that probably drove prices up overall across the board. That's kind of my takeaway on that. Not to harp too much on the upperclassmen portion again, but the way I was kind of doing back in the napkin math on values there was based on previous years and what a player of that caliber would go for, and then, adjust for how many years left they had. I think with this year, with the more robust transfer market, that math was no longer good. That data was too stale. And the prices overall have gone up, especially for those elite assets at the top of the board. So I think that was kind of a general trend I noticed. I'll pass it over to you, Joey, if you've got one.
Yeah, it's kind of like to go along with what you're saying, but I thought it was kind of like a K economy of sorts where the $300 owners are going to push up the higher end prices more. So that's kind of how I assumed it would go. Because typically, if you're selling everything, you want to at least get a marquee piece. So I felt that the way I adjusted my values was I kind of reduced the money on the lower end and kept in allocated any extra dollars to the higher end. So money was sucked out, but I sucked it out of the mid tier and lower tier players.
I think that played out. I think the bigger thing that played out was and it's very common. This is what's happened every year, and it continues to happen. Is the second copy was cheaper, even for those marquee assets. I think the second copy ended up becoming, for even some of these high end players, became even more of a value because they went so cheaper. Like notably, what was the Big 12? We'll get to them, but like Marvin Harrison and Jaden Daniels and Caleb Williams in like the Big 12 went like almost 30 to 40% cheaper than the first copies went. And I think the principle of like the dollars being there, and if a team that had a lot of money waited, like Kansas, I'll call out Kansas, they waited for those second copies to come available, they reaped a lot of benefits from that. And it seemed to bear out very well for them, where they got to hit some of these high marquee players because not only did they have the money to be able to acquire them, but they waited to where other people didn't have money to allocate onto those assets and repeat. And there were a few instances where that didn't work out that way. I think some teams had to pivot late because they waited too long. Like they were waiting for that second copy of Caleb Williams, and there was more than one team waiting, and they kind of got into a price war. And so after that price war worked out, they kind of just like, oh shit, I have nothing else to spend this money on. I got to figure out something. But I think overall that trend continues. The second copy generally is cheaper, and in this instance, I found that most of the time they were quite a value to wait for that second copy. Except for what you were saying, Joey, for the mid-tier players seem to kind of all land at around the same prices. I didn't see too big of value because I think most of the marquee was where the second copy value was in this instance. But
Yeah, I think there's just there's a big risk waiting for those studs to be there after everybody else is gone. So I mean, it's nice to see some teams being rewarded for taking that risk. I was curious, just before you kind of went into these divisions, do you have like the average price of what like Caleb and Marvin Harrison went for,
I
just
do.
overall?
Yeah, I do. So Caleb went for an average in Power 5 for $136. Marvin went for an average of 132 and went for about 136 in Power 5. Jaden Daniels went for 105 an average. Malik Neighbors went for 103 average. Roma Dunze went for 92. Xavier Worthy went for 67. Lad McConkey went for 64. JJ McCarthy went for 63. Drake May went for an average of 62. Jonathan Brooks went for 62. Brian Thomas Jr. went for 60. Bo Nix went for 58. And then Keon Coleman, Trey Benson, Brock Bowers. Oddly enough, Michael Penix Jr. went for an average of $44, which I thought was much higher than I thought we would see the market for Michael Penix Jr. But there's probably some rebate stuff that plays into some of that pricing that people were willing to extend upon. And any of these prices are in not adjusting for rebate prices, but it's just the average final spend. So like those things are interesting. It's clear that the top two assets were Caleb and Marvin Harrison Jr., followed by a tier break where Jaden Daniels, Malik Neighbors, and Roma Dunze kind of fit into it, and then a good $20 gap between the next chunk of players happen too. So does that kind of help you with Joey?
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. Keep going.
All right. This year we also saw our first player copy crack the $200 barrier. That went to Florida. We've never seen that before. We've seen a few copies get really close. I think we had like $190 and $180, but this is the first one that went over. Why that's noteworthy is $200 is the base budget amount. So in theory, this guy went for, most people get, we have an average of like $216 is usually the average budget in the league, but everyone gets $200. So at the bare minimum, that's like the floor of a price of $100 or 100% of a budget. So to see someone crack that and go $10 over that, just, I think people really value Caleb Williams quite heavily in this format, which I think was some estimation. I think we were talking about the prep for this, and I was viewing that this QB market was going to be hot, and in some places it was, in a lot of other places it was not. And Caleb Williams was the hot commodity by far for QBs and a lot of teams that felt QB needy. So, and then Marvin Harrison, I personally don't value him this high, but he definitely had a clear break over Neighbors and Adunze that I thought was far more sizable than what I was expecting. Like a $30 average break it's kind of crazy to think about, but definitely people viewed that high, view him as a top asset and size and super valuable. So definitely broke that way. So let's kind of talk about conference by conference. We'll try to be. Last thing, what you see on the screen here is to make this kind of fun, we generate a recruiting class score for teams, for rookies acquired. This is something we just do for fun. It's kind of based on what, some of those notable college football like recruiting websites do. They kind of come up with a formula, and I think we use 247's generic formula kind of thing where they scale players off of certain values, and then they give you a score based on a team a score based on their top 8 or certain number of recruits. So we do something similar. We score these players. Your top assets get full marks, and then the more assets you acquire, they count less towards your score. And I think in totality, it's your top 8 players that you get in your class accounts for your score, but people obviously get way more of that. So when you see these scores, especially the stuff that's scrolling on the right side of our screen, that's based on that score. It's superficial. There are a lot of quirks to it, like tight ends and QBs get more value to things, but this is just for a fun exercise, helps quantify things, gives people something to review and look at, but there's really nothing determinative of like this is going to play the outcome of the entire season based on how people scored on this. It's just for fun, but ECC was, like we said, had a really notable upperclassman auction. Joey, I don't know if you have thoughts on like who you thought out of this conference for the rookies did the best at all, or if there was something really noteworthy specific to your conference that is worth bringing up.
I don't know. I think if you bring up Wes's team, I think Wes did a really great job. I don't remember him transferring any major names, so he was just kind of doing it, I believe, with the dollars he had. Because you can have a great recruiting class, but if you gave up all your upperclassmen for it, yeah. I'm going to judge you a little bit differently. Yeah. But I think Wes did a great job, and Matthew, I think, did a pretty good job too.
I thought Wes did a really great job. Like you said, he didn't really have a budget to compete with a Virginia Tech, a Pittsburgh, a Virginia, those like ones that put all their assets out there. They didn't have a lot of money, and I thought like he got Bo Nix and Troy Franklin, which were his Debbie rebates. He got them back, and he got them at a pretty good price. Like he spent $49 during the auction for Bo Nix and gets $20 off. I thought that essentially a $29 price for Bo Nix is a really good price. And then he got I think he got Troy Franklin for free, or just a few dollars based on the rebate. I did really like Miami. Miami was kind of on the fence throughout the entire auction on should they spend all this money on Marvin Harrison. They had the rebate, but should they put that energy into it? And they decided to go into it. I think what helped their class overall was that they got J.J. McCarthy. I know people are on or off about J.J. McCarthy, but I think the value of a $50 quarterback for a team that already has Anthony Richardson, you kind of just set yourself up for at least a window for having two QBs on your team. He doesn't have to plan to start J.J. McCarthy. J.J. McCarthy doesn't have to carry his team, but he has someone to back up for bye weeks or injury in the future. For Anthony Richardson is going to get some kind of runway with J.J. McCarthy, hopefully, and he adds a notable asset in Marvin Harrison Jr. So I did think he was good. Let's look at the hauls for those teams that got notable rebates. So someone like Pitt, as we noted, got a bunch of money back. They went the route of just getting a bunch of wide receivers, which I think was super smart. They have CJ Stroud already on the team, so it's not like they could have gotten a second quarterback or something like that and helped that team that way. But I think getting the long-term assets of Neighbors, Odunze, and Worthy were a pretty big win for Pitt in my mind as well. Virginia Tech was another one. They spent quite a bit on Keon Coleman, Marvin Harrison Jr. I really like the Drake May dollar amount for him. He needs to get a QB on his team, so I think those are really good value adds, as well as getting Corum and some other pieces to really... Some of these teams, when they do hard resets, we saw last year, they went heavy on a really notable marquee piece, like a Bijan Robinson that came out, which was, we'll get to Virginia because they were one of those pieces that did that last year. But they kind of get just a few assets, and it's not really something it's hard to build off of because you got one sunk cost on one player, and when you kind of spread it out, I always view getting quarterback and wide receivers first is best for team building because those are more long-term assets that kind of stay evergreen. They don't really lose too much value unless the quarterback just loses his starting job, and running backs are so volatile. I just kind of wait for them to be the last pieces. So I really liked what Virginia Tech did as well. Go to Virginia. Virginia was a team last year rebuilding. They threw one of their notable assets of Breece Hall into the transfer portal this year and kind of went with a different approach than last year, where they went with the high-end guys, and they got a bunch of different pieces this year with Odunze, Adonai Mitchell, Corley, Penix, Troy Franklin, Roman Wilson. I just think this was a really good value add to add a bunch of depth. They can come in to grow into starting roles or be good value pieces that they can plug in through their starting lineup throughout the course of their eligibility, and still got some pretty good assets like Odunze's I'm going to think could be good in the future, and I think that's still a marquee grab. So I really liked what groups like this did, but he did take a different approach this year than trying to grab the top player, and you can get some ads out of that. I liked what you did, Joey. You don't do enough beating of your chest, but I like what you did with Bo Nix, Ladd McConkey, Adonai Mitchell, Benson at that price. I think you had a rebate for Benson, or was that the price that you got him for? $27.
I had a rebate. Yeah, I had a rebate on him, so I paid $47. Got him for $27.
So I think that was really good in my mind. I think you just got kind of like you said, the mid tier kind of got the money sucked out of it, and so I think you found a lot of value to add in those spaces. Like Luke McCaffrey at $11, I thought was really good. Then you just added a bunch.
I had the rebate on Daniels that I wasn't able to use, but
because he went pretty.
That happens sometimes.
Yeah,
he was at 105 or so, which I would have only been $85 for me, but at that point I just wasn't ready to pay that price for him because I'm not sure I'm a believer in him, and I already have Levis, so I was just I'm just gonna pay $50 for Knicks in pocket, the extra $35 and get a guy like Marshawn Lloyd, who I like a lot.
Let's talk about Jake a little, because Jake was a team that was originally going hard for a quarterback and upperclassman, decided to get out of that market and put all of his energy into getting a QB this year, and got a pretty modestly priced, right under average price for Caleb Williams. So he's got his immediate starter for a team that's kind of on its last immediate window for contending. He had no quarterback to speak of, but had a lot of other good assets to spend. I think if we were to look at the Martin metric, you'd see North Carolina on the plus half of the average teams, and this kind of helps put a usable asset in immediately. Somehow he got a $30 Brock Bowers. I think most conferences had him higher, like at around 50. So somehow he got even more value added out of that. So I think he did a really great job. There's some other teams that did pretty good. The teams that scored bad on the recruiting score were all the ones that spent money on upperclassmen. So I think those are notable. Yeah, I didn't think anything really went wrong for any team in the ACC, to be honest. Was there a
I think we should move on.
What's that? We should move on?
I don't know. I was ready to go through the other conferences. Yeah, we've already talked a lot about the ACC. I'm a member of it, and I don't mind, but I just know other listeners might want to hear about the other conferences.
Absolutely, Joey. We can move on to the Big Ten. The Big Ten was, like we said, more money was still available besides me. So we had a lot of... I don't know really to describe it. I thought everything went pretty well besides the noteworthy depression of the QB market. I think we've talked about this, Andy, in chat before, but the QB market to me was oddly really repressed or depressed, or however you want to say it, compared to like others. Like our Jaden Daniels went for $72 and $71 collectively. Both of our Drake May copies went for like $52, $53. We had like a $46 JJ McCarthy and a $50 JJ McCarthy. It was just an odd QB market for teams that clearly had needs at QB. I don't really know how to describe it.
Yeah, I think the macro trend here in the Big Ten was, as you mentioned, the QBs. I think we've got a lot of people that just by chance, our collection of people in Big Ten probably treat one QB more strict to one QB style, even though with the scarcity in quarterbacks, as we've mentioned before, I don't know that we mentioned on this episode, but quarterbacks seem to be expiring quicker and quicker in the NFL. That 2021 class, and in particular, that the princes who were promised. I think there's only one starting out of that group now. So quarterbacks were a need across the league as a whole. That's why we said the quarterback market was going to be a hot market this year. But yeah, I think Big Ten still treated it like it's a quarterback. You can win with any quarterback. So the prices there were lower compared to the other conferences. I do think as a result, the position players, especially the big name ones, kind of rose up a bit higher in tandem with the QB market being down. So money was still spent. And then I think, not to jump ship too quickly on that point, but the thing you mentioned about first copies, second copies, I feel like historically Big Ten has been more of a second copy is more expensive conference, and I think this was the first year that I noticed that first copies did seem to get really hot on day one, and potentially spent more money was spent on those first copies. Short of course, the few players that got starved out, and the second copies were continuing into day 3, that sort of thing. But we can chat about that a bit later. Those were the big trends I thought I saw in the Big Ten this year, though.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think most of the second copies ended up reaching right under the first copies. Like, nothing was this disparity between the first and second like we see in other conferences. So, like I said, Jaden McDaniels was like 72 and 71. That's like right there. That's essentially the same price where we saw at least some savings that happened. I think even like Brian Thomas was another one that saw something. Trey Brenson was like right on each other. Drake Mays were 52 and 54. I think your copy went first, so the second copy was more expensive, and it just was a little weird because I had no money. I ended up trying to be the QB floor. I was trying for a QB just to say if I got a QB, I was happy. That was great. I was going to try to get a second QB for just the future or whatever value, and so I was just the floor. But anything over that, just it kind of the demand died. Like everything kind of fell in that 50 to 70 mark for everyone else outside of Caleb Williams, and that was just really surprising. And I don't know if there was too many others that, I think Glad McConkey at 81 was a little bit high comparatively to other copies, but everything else was pretty good. The Marvin Harrison at 156 was obviously a noteworthy exception, and we can talk a little bit about Michigan since we're dwelling on him a little bit. If you wanted to speak to the Drake May missed opportunity.
Yeah, sure, I can. Touching on your point about price discrepancy, yeah, I'm looking at my notes, and I think second copies that were significantly cheaper were like Xavier Worthy, Jonathan Brooks, and then I think Roman Wilson was also notable. So shout out Indiana on that one. And then, yeah, second copies being more expensive. I've got Penix. The jump from copy 1 to copy 2 was pretty high. I don't remember what the second Bowers went for, but that ties in nicely to the whole Michigan Penn State thing that went on. So story time. This was day 3, I want to say, of the rookie auction. Bowers 2 and Drake May 2 were still on the board, so they kind of got starved out a bit. They didn't go as quickly as the other kind of big name second copies did. So what happened was Michigan kind of came in, went hard on Marvin Harrison on day 1, and then was pretty busy, tied up with work, if I recall, and then didn't kind of show up again until someone pinged him in Big Ten chat. So then because he was suddenly now the one with the most money left on the board, so he came in, and I believe he started going hard on Brock Bowers. So then Brock Bowers and Penn State got into a bidding war on did I just say Brock Bowers? Michigan and Penn State got into a bidding war on Brock Bowers, number 2, and it ended up in a spot where Penn State had enough free cash to box Michigan out of Brock Bowers, but Michigan then had enough cash to go take Drake May away from Penn State if he wanted, and Michigan had the rebate on Drake May, and this was the second copy. So he could have boxed out Penn State for this Drake May and gotten the rebate, but I don't think he saw it in time. The 3 hours went by, and Drake May went off the board to Penn State. So then he had to pivot to Michael Penix Jr., which is why we saw that second price so much higher. But yeah, interesting little chess match there. Michigan had him right where he wanted him and just didn't, take the final piece.
And to Michigan's point, he mentioned later that, like he didn't value Drake May as high. It just was from like noteworthy to Andy and I as we were witnessing it, just because there was the potential to even maximize your dollar output more by getting that rebate. You could have gotten $20 with an even cheaper Drake May asset to be used on other things, and it didn't materialize that way. So we were kind of curious, is he going to see it? Is he not going to see it? And he ended up either not willing to take that advantage or not witnessing it, and that was noticeable. The other was my blunder. The Marshawn Lloyd fiasco. I had bid out. I thought I had bid out or maxed out everyone for Marshawn Lloyd. I went snooping for some other dollars, and I think I was landing on Northwestern's Jatavian Sanders copy that was about to go off the board. Misread the board completely. Put a bid, freed him up, and then I almost lost Marshawn Lloyd because I thought I just misread the board, and I ended up with a more expensive Marshawn Lloyd. I think I was going to get him for like $15, and he ended up getting priced up to $22, which at the time near the end of the auction, that's noteworthy because those are just a few extra dollars that could have gone for another middling backup player. But total mismanagement of reading the board. Sometimes trying to get a little too cute for things, mixing up the board can lead to so many repercussions that you don't foresee. So the biggest one for me, I thought that did really well. I thought Minnesota did really well. two QBs, a lot of value with that. He gets to restart. He didn't have any QBs after Justin Fields lost his job, so J.J. McCarthy and Daniels, I think, instantly helps that team, and then somehow ending up with Brian Thomas, too, for a pretty modest price of $66 is such a good ad. You like to think Penn State got a pretty good value. I think they did for Drake May and somehow got Odunze. I think he had a rebate for Odunze, so that helped his pricing. But and he's got a K-shot out. I got to take that off his score. But beyond that, I think he got just a bunch of extras. I like Michigan State. They were the ones that put out a bunch of things. I think he helped his team. He got a pretty good priced Caleb Williams at $100. I think that was pretty good for him to wait and get that second copy for $20 cheaper, and then added a pretty good starting block for wide receivers after that. So I really like what Michigan State did with McConkey, Coleman, and Mitchell. Anyone else that you thought did really well? You mentioned Indiana before. I think they got a bunch of just value.
I think Penn State was kind of the one I had in mind of consistently getting good value throughout the auction that was notable in real time, at least. Yeah, we can talk through more. I know the Roman Wilson copy to Indiana was pretty well timed because I think that was during the whole Bowers fiasco, so that one just kind of went off the board before anyone else could bump that up. But yeah, I think overall people played it pretty close to the vest. Yeah, the classic Big Ten. A lot of people staying tight to their values and trying to do the best for their team.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, too bad Lou's not here because he'd get the chance to talk up his team. But the Big 12 was, based on everything we heard from Taylor and Lou, was a complete bungle by the teams that waited. Noteworthy Army and Texas and Oklahoma were the big culprits of missing or messing up the auction to a degree that they just kept pining over it in numerous chats. I think this was interesting because this is the first time. I know the West Virginia copy had a rebate, but Jaden Daniels going for 152 here was way out of alignment with every other conference predominantly. So 152 for the first copy of Daniels, and I think the second copy went for $60 less. So there was a ton of value for 6 second copies in this conference. I think Caleb Williams in this one went for $80. Where's his other Caleb Williams copy? Yeah, $87 for the second copy, where the first one went for 140, 150. So I don't know what happened, but the bottom fell out, and a lot of second copies, especially marquee talent, ended up being way cheaper. I don't know if you heard anything from Rob in SMU that was noteworthy at all for what they were seeing from this conference, but it was apparently a mess.
Oddly quiet. I did try to poke him for information, be like, yo, what's the deal? I'm hearing all of this chatter. And he basically just said, yeah, all that chatter is legit. These teams did what was said. So, yeah, I guess Lou's first-hand account is the most we got.
Yeah. So if Lou was here, he would pump up his chest for having a really great class and saying how he got all the value in the world, blah, blah, blah. His team's going to be running this conference for the next 5 years. Kansas got a lot of great value. He had the most money because he transferred everyone. And found incredible value. If you ask me, the $87 Caleb Williams, I think, was the cheapest copy by far. And then got some other pretty good talent options. Iowa State, I thought, did really well too. They ended up with that's a new coach this year, and I thought did a great job getting good talent. I think he figured out what he wanted. McCarthy, Leggett, Pearsall, Luke McCaffrey. I think that's just a good start. I think if we were going to say people that did a bad job, we would get a lot of votes for Army. Army left, I think, a lot on the table based on what Taylor and Lou were saying. They got Marvin Harrison for $125, so it was a pretty modestly priced Marvin Harrison comparatively, but just didn't do enough with the dollars apparently than whatever every other team did, and left some value on the board. And that's to each their own. You kind of eventually have to spend money at some point in auctions. And then, I don't really know what much else to say. It just seemed like there was a lot going on. There doesn't seem to be any teams that went crazy. But at the same time, it sounds like everyone went crazy or in the Big Ten. But
with those prices, why didn't Taylor get a QB? I think that was a big failure on his part, at least in my opinion.
I would agree.
He got
Joey.
great receivers.
Yeah. I would agree. I don't know if he just felt he got priced out of them because of how crazy the first copies of Williams and Jaden Daniels went for. I don't know if he was anticipating having to compete or have to spend that much on those players and wasn't comfortable with it. He did end up pivoting to Marvin Harrison Jr., oddly enough. So I'm not really sure what that rationale ended up being, but yeah.
If I recall, Taylor mentioned he was trying to just do some price enforcing. He got stuck with Xavier Worthy, which, in my opinion, is a great thing to be stuck with, but that's where all the money was tied up when he should have been going quarterback.
Yeah. Some teams that did benefit, like I think Houston and Texas Tech were teams that were QB needy. They needed a quarterback really badly. Both got quarterbacks, but I think both got Jaden Daniels. Just Texas Tech got the much cheaper version of Jaden Daniels. I think they were both heavily competing for Jaden Daniels at the start. Oklahoma State's a new team, and I think did a pretty good job kind of resetting that team with Bo Nix and some pieces to build off of. TCU was a little quiet this auction. So that's a Big 12. Big 12's an odd duck, especially with Taylor and Lou now in there. Pac-12 was really quiet. I don't really know what to make of them. They had some teams that just weren't showing up initially. If I recall, teams like UCLA and Air Force were kind of late to the party. We had some teams like Oregon State kind of waiting to spend their money till late in the auction when like a lot of second copies were showing up. Nothing super crazy though that I remember. I think their QB market was far more robust. I think like we saw higher price copies of like JJ McCarthy comparatively. We saw another 141 copy of Jaden Daniels. We had a Caleb Williams go for 170. So the QB market was a little hotter in Pac-12 comparatively to other groups. I think some teams that hit the reset button were Arizona State, and I think I liked what they did. They got Drake May, they got Xavier Worthy, Adonai Mitchell. They ended up Penix for a pretty good price. As well as some other assets that they can build their team off of because they are literally starting from zero. Wade got some good pieces for Washington State. I think Jonathan Brooks at $58 is pretty good. I think that seems actually cheaper than most others. Washington State always does well. Got its Drake May rebate copy. I don't love what UCLA maybe did. They could have maybe waited for a different quarterback. I'm glad they got a quarterback because they don't have one, but $50 for Leggett was kind of crazy, and maybe this is more of a perspective of them just waiting too long to spend money and not showing up at the initial part of the auction and having to pay for higher price second copies. Colorado did okay.
Yeah, the macro trend I was hearing, because now the call is coming from inside the house. Yeah, the call is coming from inside the house on the Pac-12 now. Shout out Aaron, new manager at Stanford. But yeah, the QB market was insane in the Pac-12. I think at one point I heard from the other room, I'm not spending $70 fucking on JJ McCarthy. So that kind of caused the whole I think the value there in the Pac-12 became all the position players, right? Mm-hmm. Like every other conference, they were QB needy, but they expressed it in a very different way than, say, the Big Ten, for example. And yeah, that meant there were deals to be had on a lot of the position players, especially like the the middling, like that mid-level talent, like the wide receivers. I guess I already mentioned it. So Stanford, if you take a look, like obviously she got her marquee Rome Odunze, but then $20 or less for all of Jermaine Burton, Javon Baker, Marshawn Lloyd, Jalen Wright, like and Jalen McMillan. Like those are all very good prices for guys with upside, right? No one's guaranteed in that range to be a good player, but they're all around 2, 3, 4 talents that are have opportunities to become something. So things like that, I think that's where the value is to be had in the Pac-12.
Definitely, it definitely looks like even though after the marquee wide receivers, the bottom kind of fell out. I think Brock Bowers was like around $40 on average there. You could see Keon Coleman to like Oregon was like 46. So I think they spent quite a bit on the initial top assets, and then it kind of fell out. I think the best value if I saw was like Cal. Did Cal have? I don't think Cal had a rebate on him, but let me double check. Cal getting Bo Nix for $35 must have been feeling like the steal of the auction, if you ask me. The fact that a $35 Bo Nix happened for all those other QB prices just seems kind of crazy. And
that's insanity. Was there a rebate in there, or was
there was no rebate.
35?
Someone must have snuck it through initially, and like it's the first copy, I have to imagine, because everyone probably
good shit,
assumed,
Cal.
Yeah, that was pretty good if you're looking at all those other ones. So, yeah. And because of the second copy, yeah, definitely. The second copy of Bo Nix went for $71. So something weird happened where he was able to get that guy through. So that was, I think, a really good value by Cal to get that to happen. So kudos to Mark to get that done. Lastly, we'll just kind of dwell on him because he'd be remiss if I didn't bring him up. But our old friend LD, I think he did a pretty good job. Somehow got a $51 Brian Thomas Jr. I think that's a really good value. Quorum will be pretty good. Javon Baker and Neighbors, I think that's a really good, solid class for a team that's on the up. So, yeah, Pac-12 probably a little more QB starved or showed that they were QB starved than other ones. So that's them. The lovely SEC, Joey, your former stomping grounds. They were a interesting mess this year. One, your old rival Tennessee did not show up for the first day and a half. It took a while. I think he was out in the mountains trotting around.
Typical fucking Ethan. Typical.
So he showed up late and started spending quite a bit. The biggest thing that happened was, as we mentioned earlier, the Florida copy. There's a big story behind the Florida copy. So that first copy of Caleb Williams that went over $200 raced out of the gates to over $200. I think it was initially Alabama and East Carolina. I won't say reckless, but they were feverish in their spend to acquire Caleb Williams for their teams. Both teams needed a QB, and Caleb Williams did have his rebate owned by Alabama, raced out to $200. I think everyone in the conference was expecting the Alabama team to get stuck with him at 209, and I think even Alabama was probably feeling some initial levels of regret for just how high that dollar went for. Maybe he set the proxy at like an initial 200, thinking no one will ever reach it, and he'll get it off in 12 hours, and maybe someone like East Carolina, the savvy captain that he is, kind of pushed the dollars up and up and up because he knew that there was just maybe no way that this team would let him go. So all that said, but in the 11th hour, I think within like 30 minutes or something really crazy, Florida swings in out of nowhere and outspends Alabama. I think the story ends up being that Florida assumed that this was not a timer reset and that if you slide in at the last moment and put a bid in, you get the player at that price. But that's just not how this format works. So I think it's a newcomer.
He bid on guys in the upperclassmen auction, so I don't get it.
I don't know either. But it led to a $200 copy. It let Alabama off the hook. Alabama went back to the second copy because this is all the first copy. This was the drama that's leading from that. Got almost $100 off the copy that he was about to spend for for Caleb Williams, and ended up allowing him to get another copy. He ended up getting Malik Neighbors for even cheaper than the first copy, which went for $130. So this was another extreme case where some teams went really hard for some high-end assets. Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Caleb Williams, some Jaden Daniels went really high. And somehow, I think through all this, Alabama navigated to acquire two high-end assets that I think they had no business acquiring at the initial start of the auction because of how high they had put their proxy for Caleb Williams. So that was quite a tale. It somehow broke the right way for Alabama, and they reaped all the benefits somehow from some dumb luck. But otherwise, saw some really crazy spending for Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors. I personally don't agree with Luigi's spending for so heavily on these assets. I don't know. Some teams think he's going to be good. I do not see maybe there's much of potential to be such a great team to be spending so much on these players at this point in time. But I think other teams that did well was Ole Miss. They hit the reset button this year and put together two quarterbacks. They did have to pay something for them, like $150 for both. But getting two quarterbacks, I think, just lends you in the future to be able to put a lot more attention into other spaces, and they were also able to grab a bunch of other players: Worthy, Jonathan Brooks, Troy Franklin, Jatavian Sanders, Jace McClellan. Well, Jace McClellan's nothing, but able to kind of well-round that piece. Ethan, I somehow was able to redeem a pretty good class with Dunze, Coleman, Corum, got Penix for a modest pricing, Luke McCaffrey. We had an interesting fiasco with the J.J. McCarthy copy. I think he was on Vanderbilt at one point, and accidentally East Carolina bid 70, one-upped his proxy, wasn't intending to, put it on the wrong player, and ended up winning him for that price. So we had a little back and forth at that point about redoing that bid, but because Vandy was very quick to bid on other players, we decided not to do that because it's kind of trying to reel in this already spindled piece of yarn, and it's kind of hard to kind of do that once they start bidding on other players at that point. So I do like, though, East Carolina's class getting a $40 Drake May. I think that's really good value for a team that needed a QB desperately to get two guys. So, yeah.
I wanted to commend Vanderbilt. He got two quarterbacks. Yeah, I got Marvin Harrison Jr. and he got Brock Bowers. Maybe because he got rid of Walker, he was able to do that. Maybe, trading, Walkers for Bowers doesn't really make much sense in the short term, but in the long term, he's put himself in a position to be a contender for a while right now, and I just think he really set himself up nicely.
I think if you're going to make that move, you're looking for the team that, as they were constructed with no QB and stuff like that, you were able to pivot to getting some more long-term assets like Nix and Penix. I think those are good. The Penix price is a little crazy, $52, but probably at that time when he bought him, he was maybe the best asset on the board, and you just kind of have to use your money, so some of this stuff comes with a grain of salt. But I do like the Bo Nix price at $40. The Bowers price at $36 is a pretty good value, especially to find ways to finagle that after he spent $140 on Marvin Harrison. And he had a $15 rebate on him, so it was like $150 he spent on him at the start. Yeah, so I think those are those pieces. I really kind of liked, as much flack as he got in the auction, I kind of like what Michael did. Michael was a team that got hit the reset button last year, got Richardson, Bijan Robinson, and another piece I can't remember, with all of his money. And then this year he kind of really went with foundational pieces, got Pearsall, McConkey, Brian Thomas, and then got some depth running back pieces that I think that's just better for the construction of his team. He caught a lot of flack for that from other SEC teams, but I think that was a good value if you asked me. Be remiss not to bring up our national champion last year, Georgia. He found his QB, needed one. He did have Will Levis on his team. He lost Justin Fields and retools it with Jaden Daniels and somehow walks away with him and Brian Thomas. So hopefully between Daniels and Levis, he's got a good competing team again to defend his title. And somehow is Michael Carter on there. I got to get rid of him too on that score. But yeah, that's SEC. Interesting group as always. And that brings us to the last conference that I think, you ask me, did way better this year than comparatively to any other conference or previous years of this conference was Minor. Minor has historically been a really odd duck. New people don't really know what to do. They don't spend enough. They're waiting too much. They aren't aggressive for how scarce the resources are there. That didn't really play out this year. I thought they were very aggressive, higher prices for even a lot of that middling depth that we talked about that didn't show in some other conferences. They really had that down with like high-end Drake May prices, high-end J.J. McCarthy prices. Jaden Daniels went for 100 plus almost for both copies. I think they did really well. They put a lot of focus on QBs. This is probably more what I was thinking I was gonna see in others, and they did a pretty good job. There was some craziness, like Penix copies going for almost $80, but given the conference, it can be seen as forgivable just to get a good asset in the door, depending on where they're spending it on. So I think it was a really much improved Minor conference this year. They really spent in the right places. There was nothing super crazy. The one call out of missed activity was stupid as Toledo and not showing up because he was spending time at Burning Man or whatever he was doing and didn't show up late. Somehow recouped some value by getting like a Brock Bowers and some Blake Corum pieces that were incredibly expensive, but did use the money as he saw fit. Yeah, I think those ones did pretty well.
Yeah, I think the QB prices there are extra excusable too, because we mentioned, the scarcity of QB across the whole league. Now you add 4 more teams bidding on the same number of QBs, it totally makes sense that everyone's driven up.
Yeah, that's why you see things like $36 Dylan Laub prices. Like, those are the tail end of the auction. I have money to spend. I'm getting it out the door on whatever I can to try to maximize it. So could there have been a little more crazier spending up at the top for like a Caleb Williams or Marvin Harrison, especially Marvin Harrison? Yeah, but I think it's all forgivable. They've done a way better job this year. I think the new people that got in, Ryan, Robbie's brother at Arkansas State, did a really good job. I thought he pushed talent up the board and got a pretty good haul with May and Neighbors. Who's another new one? Nevada was a new one. They were asking me a bunch of questions, and I think they got J.J. McCarthy and some value for their team. New Mexico State, I thought, did pretty well with Keon Coleman, Adonai Mitchell, Luke McCaffrey pieces. Hawaii, I thought, pretty good job too. Nothing like crazy where I thought, oh, they missed it. Some teams I thought they could have done maybe a little bit better were like Buffalo. They could have maybe gone for a Bo Nix that they had a rebate on and need a quarterback. They could have maybe done something better. Northern Illinois, I think, did a pretty good job getting like Jonathan Brooks and Keon Coleman at those prices for a team that's competing. I think the biggest contender from last year was Central Michigan, and they somehow walked out with a cheap, pretty reasonable, really reasonable Odunze copy. I think at a rebate of like 57, or with a rebate at a final price of 57. So they did a pretty good job getting what they needed out of their team. So those are a lot of what we had on here. Let me see if I'm missing anything. Kent State was a team that spent a little bit everywhere. They transferred people. They put all their money into Marvin Harrison, walked away with Javon Baker. They probably could have done something else. I think they transferred someone also during the auction. seems like a sideways trade-off. Yeah, they transferred Rashad White. So they did transfer from a position of strength because Taylor's previous team had a bunch of running backs and transferred Rashad and was able to get Marvin Harrison. So I guess that's a benefit for the team. They're a bunch of new guys, so I think that at least that they spent it well. Friend Chuck, I thought did a really good job. He spent a bunch on upperclassmen and still able to get McConkey, McCaffrey, and Corley were pretty good hauls for the money he had available still. So
I think Bowling Green really is set up nicely to do well. He may have to start Drake May this year, but I think his class, he got Bowers and AD Mitchell. He's got really good pieces. He seems pretty deep for a minor team. If Mac Jones didn't turn into shit, he might have had more, two QBs.
yeah,
But I think that's a team that kind of stands out, at least to me. I just kind of like the pieces that he has.
yeah, and some of the teams that sold their players off, like UNLV in New Mexico, I thought did a pretty good job. They got some good value out of those things as well. I don't hate anything anyone did, which I think's rare. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't say this. Again, I'm gonna harp on this one because I think they just spent kind of weirdly. Western Michigan again spending $60 on senior and junior tight ends, and then spending everything essentially on Caleb Williams was again a little bit odd to me. They could find some use of those players for sure. Doesn't make a lot of logical sense in my mind to do a lot of that pairing because I don't think that they're that close to competing in this conference when you look at their team in like Central Michigan and stuff like that. But he did need a quarterback. Caleb Williams, he's really only got Najee Harris and Nico Collins on his team. So it seemed like disproportionate spending on what's on his roster versus what he could have used that dollars for. That's probably the only one that I thought was like, what the hell's going on here? But otherwise, I thought they impressed me. They did much better than before or previous years. So maybe we're starting to explain the format a little bit more. Teams that have been in there have been doing a better job finding the right pieces. But all of this to bring us to the end of our auction recap. Like I said, scores here for fun. People can review them, see what they agree or disagree. The next steps in our league is moving into scheduling. Scheduling is started as of today. People can schedule their games with other teams. Weeks 1 through 3 are non-conference this year, and weeks for Power 5 conferences, weeks 4 and 5 are cross-conference. So that means you play the other division those 2 weeks, so you can schedule games against the other division if you like. Minor does not have that ability. They are having to play their division from the start because of just the number of teams that they have there. You can see there's a link on our site for this. You can see the teams. You have to fill out this Google form. And also new this year is the ability to schedule some rivals. So rivals, this isn't working at the moment because no one's inputted a rival, but you can schedule a rival. You can schedule a wager for money if you want to pay for or compete for dollars between your rival. The losing team has to pay money for the next year's budget into the team that won or their rival that won. So a little bit of a competitive piece that's been added this year. I don't know if you guys have any advice on how to do scheduling. I do definitely take some things into consideration on my own on who I schedule and where, but if you guys have any thoughts or wanted to share those with people, you have the time to do that too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple schools of thought here. I know a lot of people like to, what is it, like if you're a cupcake team that you like to try to make it like pay for recruiting bucks to get the free win for teams that are competing. I'm personally more of a let's do everything for free, and if my team is good enough, I'll win enough and propel me that way. But yeah, there's options like that. If you're a good team and you want that strength of schedule to bump up at risk of accidentally losing, obviously go for someone in that 30 to 50 rank, something like that. Yeah, but there's a lot of ways to do it. I don't know that we have a quote unquote best version. So yeah,
I think it depends on your team, like the makeup of your team. You mentioned teams that suck or are cupcakes or whatever they want to call themselves. I think they have all the benefit in the world not to schedule tough teams. Like there's no value for them to schedule a tough team if they're not trying. Like they should be just trying to get wins. And so they should either schedule other cupcake teams, or if teams want to schedule them that are better, then they could maybe eke out some dollars. But there's no real incentive, especially when it comes to conference games. So if you're a Power 5 team that's bad or expected to be bad, you should be laying it out there. I'll let another team play me for a free conference win, which is actually has a pretty good level of value for conference standings. Maybe some teams will pay you for it. Joey, I don't know if you have any thoughts. You were kind of bartering
I
around.
paid, yeah. I paid last year for my conference wins. I knew it was going to be the conference wins are so important. Just because you want to make it to the conference championship game. So if you think you're a really good team, I automatically just look for the crappiest ones and just offer them $3. Nobody's going to say no. I think just with bye weeks and injuries, so many things can happen anyway, and it's such a short conference season. I want to try and give myself every chance to get to conference championship game. So I think paying the $3 if you're a great team is worth it because you're going to get the buck back for the win anyway.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that those are super valuable. The thing that does change because we expanded the playoffs this year is the conference championship and auto bid is not nearly as important as it was previously. So there is still the auto bid for conference champions. They get money for one thing. They get $50. You get $50 for winning your division. You get $50 for winning your conference. If you win your conference, you get an auto bid into the playoffs. If you were outside of the top 8 in the rankings, you still get in. That still carries through, but obviously with 16 spots, it's a little bit easier to get in on at-large bids. So it's still important. It's still an easier thing. There's a bigger avenue for dollars to be won. If you win your division, you get $50. That covers your buy-in. If you win your conference, you get another $50. That's $100 payout right there. So getting a conference win by even just paying a few recruiting dollars seems like a win if it helps you get to those steps to secure some actual payout money. So yeah, that I agree with you, Joey. I'd be willing to spend some. I did last year. I spent like $6 on teams that were bad to try to help me. It didn't pay off because Andy's team was so good last year, but there's some definite ways to take advantage of this to benefit you too. So something to consider, something to put a little thought into. Teams can definitely take it where they want to play their friends, or they want to take an easy schedule, or they just don't care, or they just want to play whoever's willing to play them. All of that's fine. There's no wrong way to do it, but there can be, if you think about it enough and put some intention to it, there can be some benefit to it for a team. It's definitely there. As well as, like we said, cupcakes, bad teams, they have no incentive unless they're given an incentive, so they should schedule each other, because if they win 6 games somehow, if you are a Power 5 team and you schedule 5 bad teams and you somehow win 5 of those games, you're 1 win away from making a bowl game. And while that doesn't really do anything, it's still $6. Making a bowl game is still money to put towards next year, so there's value in that. So any last remarks from either of you guys? Otherwise, I will give you back your Saturdays, and I appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Super fun league, probably my favorite that I play in. So thanks for continuing to do what you do, Brian.
Thank you, Andy. All right, I appreciate you both, and hopefully see everyone else in Slack at some point.